The palace walls shook with whispers. King Charles had finally uttered the words, "No one thought he'd dare. It ends now." For Queen Camilla, this was more than a warning. It was exile from the very stage she had fought to claim. The words spread like wildfire, igniting a frenzy not only within the gilded corridors of Buckingham Palace, but across the world. Within hours, headlines screamed that the Queen Consort had been stripped of her royal role at state functions. What began as murmurs in hushed corners of the palace transformed into a thunderous roar of speculation, outrage, and disbelief. The monarchy, already under a microscope, now found itself at the center of a scandal unlike anything seen in decades. The media circled like vultures, tearing apart every word, every nuance, every moment of the king's announcement. Commentators labeled it the most brutal royal punishment in decades, a humiliation so public and so final that it left even seasoned royal watchers stunned. No quiet withdrawal, no carefully crafted excuse of health or rest. This was a king's thunderous decree. Camilla was no longer welcome on the stage she had once dominated. The reaction was immediate and merciless. Newspapers splashed her name across their front pages in fonts that screamed betrayal. Television anchors dissected her downfall with a mix of pity and glee, while the public, long divided over her role in the monarchy, erupted with judgment. For some, it was vindication. For others, a shocking act of cruelty. Yet, even as the headlines roared, the question lingered like smoke in the air. What had she done? For Charles, this was no passing anger. It wasn't a sudden, irrational outburst from a weary king. His fury had the weight of years behind it, years of doubt, whispers, and private fears that had now erupted in a single, devastating sentence. This was not the wrath of a husband, but the judgment of a monarch. And yet, the palace remained silent, its gilded gates locked tight, as though determined to conceal the true cause of this fracture. Camilla's silence, however, only fueled suspicion. She offered no statement, no defense, no tearful appeal to the public. That silence became its own confession. In the minds of many, a void filled with speculation about hidden letters, clandestine meetings, and secrets too dangerous to remain in the dark. Every absence, every refusal to explain herself, was twisted into proof that she had crossed a line even Charles could no longer forgive. The woman who had once withstood a nation's scorn now stood isolated, branded as the betrayer of the very monarchy she had fought to legitimize. And the world held its breath, desperate to uncover the truth. For behind the pomp of banquets and the grandeur of state carriages, a darker drama had been playing out, one of deception, betrayal, and a royal marriage that had finally buckled under its own contradictions. Every commentator asked the same burning question. What could have possibly been so grave, so unforgivable, that the king himself chose to banish his queen from the heart of the monarchy? The stage was set for an explosive revelation. For Charles's words, "It ends now," were not born from a fleeting temper. They were the culmination of secrets that had gnawed at the foundations of the crown, of betrayals that had cut deeper than any private quarrel. And while the world gasped at the drama unfolding in the spotlight, few understood that the real story, the betrayal that shattered the fragile union between Charles and Camilla, was still waiting to be unearthed. But to understand why Charles reached his limit, we must peel back the layers of deception and betrayal that led to this explosive command. Behind palace curtains, Camilla's actions tore through the monarchy like a dagger. What Charles discovered wasn't merely indiscretion. It was betrayal that endangered the crown itself. For years, whispers had floated through the halls of Westminster and Windsor alike, suggesting that the Queen Consort's ambitions stretched far beyond ceremonial duties. At first, Charles dismissed them as idle chatter, the sort of poisonous gossip that had haunted his family for generations. But whispers, when ignored, have a way of growing louder, and soon the shadows were speaking too clearly to be ignored. The first signs came quietly, almost imperceptibly. Reports reached Charles that Camilla had been seen in hushed conversations with influential political figures, men and women whose hands were firmly tied to the levers of power. At first, it seemed innocent enough after all. Royals and politicians had long walked the same corridors. But the tone of those meetings raised eyebrows among the king's most trusted advisors. There were rumors of promises exchanged, of influence bartered, not in the name of the monarchy, but in service of her family's future. These weren't gestures of unity, they were acts of maneuvering, moves on a board Camilla had no right to play. Then came the evidence, stark and undeniable. Documents surfaced, correspondence that made Charles's blood run cold. Letters in Camilla's hand, carefully written, hinting at appointments she wished to see filled, honors she wished to secure, and financial favors that would strengthen not the monarchy, but her bloodline. The revelation struck at the very heart of Charles's role as king. The monarchy was not a tool to elevate relatives. It was, in his eyes, a sacred trust, a bond with the people, one he believed his mother had guarded with unshakable loyalty. And now, in the woman he had once defended against the world, he saw that bond being twisted into something self-serving and corrupt. When he confronted her, the palace trembled with the force of his fury. It was not the quiet, restrained anger of a husband wronged, but the thunder of a sovereign betrayed. His voice carried the weight of centuries, and yet it cracked with heartbreak as he uttered the words, "You betrayed the monarchy, not just me." For Camilla, there was no reply that could soften the blow. Her denials rang hollow, her explanations twisted into excuses. To Charles, every word confirmed what the evidence had already made clear, that the woman he had raised onto the throne beside him had been working against the very institution he had sworn to protect. In those moments, the memory of his mother loomed over him. Queen Elizabeth's warnings, often delivered in her quiet, steady voice, echoed in his mind. She had spoken often of loyalty, of the dangers of allowing personal bonds to cloud one's duty to the crown. And now, standing before the woman for whom he had once sacrificed his reputation and defied his country, Charles realized the truth of those words in the cruelest way possible. The betrayal was not merely personal, it was institutional. It had wounded the monarchy itself, leaving scars that would not easily fade. The realization cut deep. For this was not just a breach of trust between husband and wife, it was a fracture that threatened the very survival of the monarchy. The betrayal was too vast, too public, too corrosive to remain hidden. Every decision Camilla had touched, every meeting she had attended, was now tainted with suspicion. Advisors wondered aloud how far her influence had spread, and whether the very machinery of the monarchy had been compromised by her quiet ambitions. But betrayal inside the monarchy is never just private. It spreads, poisoning every corner of the palace until the very foundation trembles. If Charles's voice thundered with anger, Prince William's silence was more dangerous. He had waited years for this reckoning, and now his fury burned colder than fire. While his father's emotions boiled over in the confrontation with Camilla, William stood still, restrained, watching with the quiet intensity of a man who had foreseen this downfall long before it arrived. For William, this was not a sudden shock. It was the inevitable collapse of a fragile facade he had always doubted. His silence was not a weakness, it was judgment, and in that judgment lay the most chilling truth of all. William would not forgive. From the earliest days of Camilla's presence within the royal household, William's disapproval had been a constant, unspoken shadow. He had played the part of dutiful son, shaking hands, exchanging polite words, but beneath the surface, he harbored a mistrust he never entirely concealed. Privately, in the safety of conversations few would ever hear, William had warned his father with blunt finality. "She cannot be trusted." These were not the careless remarks of a man unwilling to accept his stepmother. They were words born from instinct, from a deep understanding of loyalty, and from the echoes of a mother's memory that still guided his heart. Each warning Charles brushed aside only hardened William's conviction that one day the truth would surface. That day had finally come. What drove William's fury, however, was not simply the betrayal of a throne, it was the threat to the family he was sworn to protect. His protective instinct toward Catherine and their children burned like an unquenchable flame. He had watched how Camilla maneuvered within the palace, how whispers of her schemes reached beyond state matters into personal territory, and he feared the ripple effect it could have on his wife and children. For William, Catherine represented stability, dignity, and the continuation of his mother's legacy. To see Camilla's influence tarnish that vision was intolerable. This wasn't just about preserving the monarchy, it was about safeguarding the bloodline that would inherit it. In those tense days following Charles's command, William became more than just the heir to the throne. He became the voice of the monarchy's future, calm but unyielding, a figure who refused to compromise with deception or betrayal. While Charles wrestled with the conflict between kingly duty and marital loyalty, William stood as the immovable reminder that sentiment could no longer outweigh truth. He was not swayed by Camilla's tears, nor softened by her pleas. To him, the betrayal was absolute. and so too must be the consequence. His silence in public was calculated. Behind closed doors, his influence was unmistakable. This clash between father and son stretched beyond the personal into the symbolic. Charles, torn between the vows he made as a husband and the duty he carried as a king, hesitated, haunted by the wreckage of his private life colliding with his public crown. But William's resolve left little room for hesitation. The new generation of monarchy, the one destined to carry the crown forward, could not allow shadows to linger. Where Charles faltered, William demanded clarity. Where Charles wept, William steeled himself. The rift between them was not born of disagreement over duty. It was born of the difference in how they chose to wield it. And through it all, the foreshadowing of William's role in enforcing the ban grew clearer. Every advisor who watched the silent exchange between father and son knew the truth. It was William's steady hand, his unflinching resolve, that had pushed Charles to act decisively. The ban may have carried the king's voice, but the weight of it belonged to the heir. In his silence, William had made himself heard. And yet, William wasn't the only royal who had seen this storm coming. Another figure had been warning of betrayal all along. In the shadows of Windsor, Princess Anne whispered words that cut to the heart. "You ignore this at your peril." Charles didn't listen until it was too late. For years, Anne had watched the uneasy rise of Camilla with a wary eye, never fully surrendering her trust, never convinced that her sister-in-law's intentions were aligned with the dignity of the monarchy. She had tolerated her, endured her presence, and performed the public rituals of acceptance, but within her remained a deep skepticism that never truly faded. To Anne, Camilla's charm was a mask, her gestures a performance, her loyalties uncertain. Where others softened, Anne hardened, standing firm as the silent guardian of a legacy she believed was slipping into dangerous hands. It was not jealousy or rivalry that shaped Anne's mistrust. It was history. She had lived too long in the shadow of scandals and fractures that nearly broke the royal family. She had witnessed the pain of betrayal in her brother's marriage to Diana, had seen the monarchy reduced to near collapse under the weight of infidelity and disillusionment. And, above all, she had carried the burden of her mother's unspoken wishes, the quiet assurances Queen Elizabeth II had entrusted to her before leaving this world. Those words, simple but unshakable, still echoed in her mind. Loyalty above all else. For Elizabeth, the monarchy was never about power. It was about service, sacrifice, and unbreakable devotion. Anne, more than anyone, took those words as a personal vow. And it was through that lens that she measured Camilla, finding her unworthy of the trust her brother so desperately gave. Anne's warnings came quietly, never shouted in public, never forced upon Charles in ways that could humiliate him. She had approached him in moments of private calm, urging caution, sharing whispers of Camilla's questionable dealings, and reminding him that the crown could not be risked for personal affection. "You must tread carefully," she had urged him, her tone steady, her eyes unflinching. "The monarchy is not yours to gamble. It belongs to the nation, and you ignore this at your peril." Charles, blinded by love and weighed down by guilt from the past, had dismissed her as overprotective, as cynical, but Anne's instincts had never failed her, and she knew the storm was coming. The emotional weight of those warnings grew heavier in Charles's mind once the truth of Camilla's betrayal surfaced. Suddenly, every word from his sister replayed with cruel clarity. He saw his mother's face in his memories, recalling her quiet insistence that personal desires could never come before duty. He saw Anne's firm resolve, the same steel that had kept her unwavering through decades of service, and he realized that he had chosen to ignore the one person who had always placed the monarchy above herself. The tension between them was not explosive, but it was profound. Charles had built his choices on hope and sentiment, while Anne had built hers on duty and foresight. And now, as the truth of Camilla's dealings lay bare, Charles recognized that his sister had been right all along. Anne had not spoken out of malice. She had spoken out of devotion to the monarchy, a devotion that surpassed familial ties, personal comfort, and even love. Where Charles wavered, Anne stood unyielding. Her resolve was clear. She would protect the monarchy above all personal connections, even if it meant watching her brothers suffer the consequences of ignoring her. But what Anne knew was only a fraction of what the world was about to learn. Secrets buried deep were finally dragged into daylight. Locked away in gilded drawers, documents surfaced that turned whispers into undeniable proof. These were not rumors, they were weapons of truth against Camilla. For years, suspicions had circled the palace like restless ghosts, but suspicion alone was never enough to fracture the crown. It was the papers, the signatures, the trails of ink that stripped away all pretense and left the betrayal naked before the king. Hidden contracts, sealed envelopes, and confidential correspondence revealed a web of influence that stretched beyond the monarchy's walls, reaching into government offices and private accounts. In those documents lay the truth Charles could no longer deny. The woman he had defended against the world had used his throne as a shield for her own designs. The first revelation came in the form of leaked financial records. Carefully traced and authenticated, they revealed that Camilla had directed favors and quiet sums to benefit her own relatives. These were not charitable gestures made in the spirit of generosity. They were calculated maneuvers, positioning her family for advantages far beyond what tradition would have ever allowed. Every page was a wound, every figure a reminder that the crown's honor had been leveraged in secret. What Charles once believed to be loyalty was exposed as ambition cloaked in the guise of support, but the betrayal did not stop there. Among the papers were letters in Camilla's own hand, written with precision, each line carrying an intent that cut to the heart of the monarchy's credibility. She had lobbied discreetly for appointments, pressuring allies and whispering in corridors to place individuals favorable to her influence in roles of state. Advisors, appointments, even ceremonial posts were touched by her hand. To Charles, it was an act of audacity that blurred the sacred boundary between monarchy and manipulation. The king, whose crown was meant to represent impartiality, now faced the stain of his own consort's interference. Terrified palace aides, long silenced by fear of reprisal, began to break ranks. Some did so reluctantly, their voices quivering as they shared what they had seen. Others came forward with determination, unable to carry the weight of the deception any longer. Their testimonies painted a chilling picture of late-night meetings, secretive exchanges, and instructions issued under Camilla's authority. These revelations, once whispered in corridors, were now written into the record. When confronted with the evidence, Charles's heartbreak spilled into words sharper than any blade. "You used my crown as your shield," he told her, the line echoing with centuries of betrayal. It was the lament of a man who realized that the very symbol he had sworn to uphold had been wielded against him, twisted into a weapon not of service, but of self-interest. The pain was not only personal, it was constitutional. The monarchy itself had been compromised, and the documents made it impossible to contain the truth. The media erupted like a storm. Front pages screamed of corruption, betrayal, and manipulation at the very heart of the palace. Commentators declared it the darkest chapter of Charles's reign, while public outrage swelled into fury. For a monarchy already walking a fragile line of public trust, the revelations were catastrophic. The betrayal was no longer hidden. It was documented, stamped, signed, and undeniable. And in that ink, in those signatures, lay the most symbolic image of all. The monarchy's honor reduced to paperwork, its betrayal etched in black and white. The power of the crown, diminished by the hand of the one meant to uphold it. The revelations tore at the monarchy's fabric, but it was the public reaction that transformed scandal into crisis. For the people, it was a battle between loyalty to their king and disillusionment with their queen. Streets buzzed with one question: has Camilla destroyed the monarchy? The revelations had torn through the nation with a force stronger than any royal scandal in living memory. For decades, the monarchy had been a fragile thread of tradition, binding the people to their sovereign. Now, that thread seemed ready to snap under the weight of betrayal. Crowds gathered outside royal palaces, waving banners and chanting demands that Camilla step aside. What had once been a love story, redeemed in the eyes of some, had transformed into a lightning rod of fury. And the call for her removal echoed from city centers to quiet villages. Polls mirrored the unrest. Numbers that once showed tentative support for Camilla collapsed overnight. Approval ratings crumbled, not just slipping, but plummeting into the depths of distrust. Each headline grew sharper, each broadcast more unforgiving. Where once she had been reluctantly accepted as Queen Consort, she was now branded the woman who had betrayed the crown. Her name became synonymous with scandal. Her image transformed into a symbol of everything the monarchy was fighting to preserve itself against. For a public that had endured years of turbulence, Camilla was no longer a partner to the king. She was the fracture that threatened to break the institution in two. Yet not all voices sang the same chorus. Divisions carved through the royal supporters, with some standing in defiant defense of Camilla, insisting that she was being scapegoated for sins larger than herself. Old loyalties, personal sympathies, and long memories of her sacrifices kept a fraction of the public clinging to her side. But the louder voices belonged to those who demanded her exile. These divisions spilled into the press, onto talk shows, into debates at dinner tables across the nation. The monarchy, meant to unify, had become a battleground of opinion, splitting the people who once rallied behind the crown. And as the storm raged, the media found a new figure to elevate. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, was portrayed not merely as William's wife, but as the true queen in waiting. She was painted as the antidote to scandal, the symbol of purity, loyalty, and dignity. In contrast to Camilla's betrayal, articles exalted her quiet strength, her unwavering devotion to duty, and her ability to embody the legacy of Diana while shaping a future in her own right. In Catherine, the press found the image of stability the nation craved, and the contrast only deepened Camilla's isolation. For Charles, the pressure was unbearable. He was no longer a husband shielding his wife from the storm. He was a king whose every move was scrutinized by millions. Every public appearance, every silence, every pause in his speech was dissected for meaning. Could he still protect Camilla without destroying the monarchy? Could he remain a loving husband and still serve as a sovereign untainted by scandal? The strain pulled at him from both sides, leaving him suspended in an impossible position. And yet, through all the uncertainty, one truth loomed larger with each passing day. A final dramatic showdown was inevitable. The whispers of betrayal had evolved into roars of protest. The quiet discontent within the palace had become a national crisis. The king could no longer remain silent. His decision had to be public, final, and absolute. Behind closed doors, their voices rose, Charles and Camilla, locked in a battle of words that would decide the monarchy's future. "It ends now," he thundered. For years, tension had simmered beneath the surface, unspoken doubts buried under royal duty and marital vows. But now, with the evidence of betrayal laid bare and the nation demanding answers, the storm finally broke. Charles confronted her not as a husband, but as a king betrayed. His tone was not just wounded, it was final, echoing with the gravity of a monarch who knew the survival of the crown was at stake. He accused her without hesitation, stripping away the polite restraint that had once shielded their arguments. Every word was charged with pain. Every syllable carried the weight of betrayal. "Your disloyalty cuts deeper than any enemy," he spat, his voice trembling with both fury and heartbreak. "You did not only betray me, you betrayed the monarchy itself." For Charles, the private wounds of their marriage paled beside the public disgrace, now tied to her name. He had sacrificed so much for her, endured criticism, scandal, and years of disapproval. Yet now, faced with undeniable proof, he realized that the very loyalty he had once defended had been squandered. Camilla, faced with the full force of his accusations, broke into tears. Her denials came quickly, desperate and trembling, each word a plea to salvage what remained of their bond. She insisted she had never meant harm, that her choices had been misinterpreted, that she was being cast as the villain of forces larger than herself. But her tears did little to move Charles. Where once her vulnerability might have softened him, now it only deepened his sorrow. He listened, but the distance in his gaze revealed that her words could not erase the stain of betrayal. For Charles, this was agony. He had once defied the world for her, against public anger, against his family's doubts, against the memory of a beloved wife lost too soon. He had chosen Camilla. She had been his companion, his comfort, the woman for whom he endured years of scandal. And yet, in this confrontation, he realized that the love which had once shielded her could no longer outweigh the burden of the crown. The monarchy was older than both of them, larger than their love, and stronger than his private loyalties. To protect it, he would have to sever what remained of their union in the public eye. The decision weighed on him like a stone. But there was no path left. His voice, now stripped of hesitation, declared the sentence that would reverberate through history. Camilla would be banned from all state functions. She would no longer stand at his side for ceremonies, no longer share the stage of power she had fought to occupy. It was exile without departure, a silencing without removal, and in many ways, a punishment far harsher than abdication. She would remain his wife, but she would no longer be his queen in the eyes of the world. The moment was shattering. For Charles, It was both liberation and loss. The culmination of a love story turned tragedy. For Camilla, it was humiliation wrapped in heartbreak, her influence stripped away in the stroke of her husband's words. But as devastating as the confrontation was, its consequences reached far beyond their private anguish. Because even as Charles declared her exile, the echoes of betrayal refused to be silenced, because the monarchy itself now faced its darkest test. Banished from the balcony, erased from ceremonies, Camilla's absence was louder than her presence had ever been. For years, she had stood beside Charles, her place at his side, a defiant symbol of their resilience against public scorn. But now, that space remained empty, and the void spoke louder than words. Each appearance of the king alone was a reminder of fracture, a silent declaration that the monarchy had shifted course. Crowds noticed. Commentators noticed. The absence was undeniable, and it forced the world to ask whether the Queen Consort had become nothing more than a shadow exiled from the very throne she once fought to claim. For Charles, the image was agonizing. He had long dreamed of a reign where his wife would finally be accepted. Yet now he appeared before his people as if half a monarch, his crown intact, but his marriage fractured in full view of the world. Every wave, every carefully chosen word, carried the weight of that absence. Yet, while Charles bore the scars of betrayal, another figure quietly rose to steady the ship. Catherine, silent but resolute, stepped into the role of stabilizer with effortless dignity. Without speeches, without theatrics, she became the counterbalance to scandal. Her poise reassured the public. Her presence beside William offered the sense of continuity that the monarchy so desperately needed. Where Camilla's name had become tainted with suspicion, Catherine's became synonymous with loyalty and endurance. And beside her, William emerged as the face of strength. His measured demeanor, his controlled silence, and his unshakable image of duty provided a stark contrast to the chaos of betrayal. For many, William no longer represented only the heir to the throne. He symbolized the monarchy's survival. He was seen as the future, one who would inherit not a kingdom weakened by scandal, but a kingdom he had fought to preserve. Together, William and Catherine formed a united front, their partnership casting a long shadow that made Camilla's exile appear not only necessary, but inevitable. Meanwhile, Camilla retreated into isolation. Stripped of her ceremonial power, she disappeared from the public stage. Yet her silence was not interpreted as surrender. Whispers grew that she was plotting her next move, carefully considering how to reclaim influence or strike back. Allies close to her refused to vanish quietly, and there were hints of strategy brewing in the shadows. Her absence, once expected to calm the storm, instead stirred a new unease. For some, she had become a fallen queen waiting. For others, she remained a dangerous player, too proud to accept her fate. The international press wasted no time in framing the situation with sensational flair. Headlines called it a royal divorce in everything but name. They painted a picture of a monarchy split in two, a king still bound by marriage, but separated in duty, a queen who wore the title but no longer the crown. Analysts dissected every gesture, every silence, predicting whether Camilla's fall would end in quiet retreat or in a dramatic counterattack. The more the palace remained silent, the louder the speculation became. And so, a haunting question lingered in the air. Had the betrayal truly been buried, or was Camilla simply biding her time, waiting for the moment to strike back? The monarchy, though outwardly stable, remained fragile beneath the surface, every whisper reminding the nation that exile was not always the end. For Charles, one final reckoning remained the question of legacy, and whether his choice would save the monarchy or destroy it forever. As the king looked out from Buckingham's balcony alone, the world asked, had Charles preserved the monarchy or signed its death sentence with his own hands? The image was stark. A solitary figure weighed down not just by a crown, but by the choices that had led to this moment. In the silence of that balcony, the sacrifice was clear. He had surrendered the love he once protected above all else, choosing instead the heavy burden of duty. It was a decision that tore his heart in two, but to Charles, the survival of the crown demanded nothing less. Public opinion, however, remained divided. Some hailed him as a monarch of principle, a man who placed his kingdom above his personal life, echoing the resolve of his late mother. Others condemned him as ruthless, branding his punishment of Camilla as cruel, even cold. The fracture in perception mirrored the fracture within the monarchy itself, leaving the people to question whether this act had saved the institution or hastened its decline. Now, the future rested not with Charles alone, but with William and Catherine, whose unity and strength had become the monarchy's lifeline. Their image of stability reassured the world. But beneath the surface, Camilla's silence remained an ominous shadow. For silence, in the palace, is never final. It conceals. It waits. It plots. Charles, haunted by his own words, "It ends now," knew that endings within the monarchy are rarely absolute. Was this the conclusion of Camilla's reign, or merely the pause before her revenge reshaped the palace once more? One chapter has closed, but the war inside the palace is far from over. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.